Ella, we are live. Thank you for joining me today. And thank you everyone who is watching. This is a new series that I'm starting called Now Written Live. Obviously my company is called Unwritten Health. And really our mission is to try and ensure that there's representation in the data across the whole drug life cycle. So hence why it's written. So I'm really excited to introduce Ella. And Ella is a passionate patient advocate, consultant, and an individual living with cystic fibrosis, which, if you're not aware of, is a rare genetic lung disease. And she was diagnosed very young, at just 18 months old. And drawing both on her background, she has studied biology, but also her own healthcare journey. Ella works with startups and biotechs to design genuinely patient-centered approaches to drug and product development. So I'm really excited to have Ella on this call today. Ella, do you just want to add anything else to just introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for having me today and for this conversation. I'm really looking forward to it. Hi, everyone. My name is Ella Balasa. I'm, as Ashish said, living with cystic fibrosis, and over the last number of years have really become involved in being a representative for patient communities and helping to bring patient voice into drug development and into thinking about how to effectively and meaningfully engage patients and overall improve healthcare and healthcare outcomes. So I know I'm excited for today's topic. It's something that's very meaningful to me because of my own lived experience, and I know we'll kind of get into the conversation now.
Thank you very much, Ella. And I think to frame this conversation, I think the main question is, how does a clinical trial decide who is worth studying, as in who the participants are? And I think that's the interesting point, because Ella, maybe you could just explain a little bit about lung function and yours being 27%, and what that means for you before we get into your cystic fibrosis journey.
Yeah, so obviously with cystic fibrosis, the lung is the main organ that's affected. And so in a lot of cystic fibrosis trials, lung function is what is measured as a primary outcome. And also in, for determining the population that will be included in the trial, there is a certain level of lung function that a participant has to have to be able to be eligible for participation in these trials. So without going too much detail, but my lung function and my disease is pretty advanced and progressed. So at this point, I have about 27% lung function remaining. And the average person has 100, but with cystic fibrosis, as the disease deteriorates the lung tissue over time, then this leads to a reduction in the function of the lung, and therefore there's less air being able to move in and out with breaths, and this is what's measured as part of that lung function or lung capacity. And in a lot of cystic fibrosis clinical trials, and for many years, this measure of lung function obviously has been a primary measure, a primary outcome. And also in order to keep the window of eligibility in patients that maybe are not too sick, but are healthy enough to participate in these trials, and then to see some efficacy, seeing that improvement, ever since I can remember, ever since trials have been around for cystic fibrosis, this measure has been above 40%. And then typically less than 90%. So it's that window in order to see that change in lung function. But this means that patients like me have been excluded from these trials because of the more advanced lung disease. And with the advancement of some drugs in cystic fibrosis over the last decade or so, some of these treatments that have come to market, all of these trials too have had this inclusion criteria standard. And what this means is, there was a number of years ago that there was a drug that I was actually eligible for to take based on my mutation, the mutation of the disease that I have. And I was not eligible for the trial. And, with that, at the time, I was very much in need of a new therapeutic, was dealing with lung infections constantly, needing, intravenous antibiotics to treat these lung infections, having to use oxygen more frequently because my lungs weren't functioning well. And so, unfortunately, I had to wait until this drug came to market, which obviously was a number of years later. Although it was, it has showed a lot of efficacy and was rapidly brought to market. Nonetheless, it was a very challenging time for me to know that there may be a therapy effective. However, there was no way for me to access until at some point it were to come to market. So, I can talk a little bit more about that. But really, this highlights the need for redefining the way that we, not just in cystic fibrosis, obviously, but across conditions, for companies to redefine and to understand better, how a patient is affected by a disease on a day-to-day basis. So now that, I will say that now I've been on this treatment that has been approved for cystic fibrosis, and my lung function has remained relatively the same, about, in the 20% range, or 27% as of now. But with this treatment, my day-to-day life has been improved. And I am not experiencing as much of the mucus in my lungs on a day-to-day basis. I haven't been needing to use intravenous antibiotics frequently. I'm not coughing as often on a day-to-day basis. I have more endurance when I'm walking or, trying to exercise, minimally trying to exercise. But this improvement in my quality of life wasn't really captured by the lung function number that I had been breathing before starting this treatment and now subsequent. So all to say is that though this lung function measure, was used in this trial and is used, across cystic fibrosis trials, it isn't the sole or best indicator of a patient's quality of life and the way by which a treatment can benefit a community or a population. And so this example really just highlights that, and that my lung function hasn't changed over the course of these years by any statistically significant value, maybe 3 percentage points across, 0 to 100. But quality of life day to day, I am living a much better life. And this isn't captured in the data, and it wasn't even captured. This is only understood when as a patient, I share this information. I share this to the pharmaceutical companies. I share this to the CF population. And so I think and I'll stop here with the story and then let you answer, ask me more questions specifically. But last thing I'll just say is that it really highlights the need for companies to redefine, to understand what is affecting a community, what are the symptoms and what are the benefits that a treatment could provide for a community, and really think about how can we incorporate that into the design of trials as we move forward, and as we are using technologies to capture different kinds of quantitative data, and how we can incorporate that into understanding better disease progression or the quality of life conditions, and how treatments may be improving those outside of the endpoints and the inclusion criterias that define those endpoints up until this point.
No, that's really, really, really interesting, and a really good framing for this conversation, Nella. And I think you sort of done that segue for me beautifully. So beyond those sort of clinical endpoints and so on, how has life with this condition looked like for you, particularly in recent years? Maybe I know you talked about how things have improved being on this new product, but what's the comparison from before? Like, on a day-to-day basis, what would that actually look like?
So yeah, but before this treatment, I was not able to really live independently, truthfully. I was, in my early to mid 20s and having to have support to, on a day-to-day basis, because I was having to do breathing treatments 4 or more times a day, spanning an hour each time, coughing out a lot of green mucus that just never ceased, having to be hospitalized every few months to get intravenous antibiotics over like a 3-week course. And that was very burdensome and challenging and difficult to navigate. And I'm still am physically limited in what I can do, like as far as like physical exertion. I can't run or any sort of like strenuous activity, but nonetheless, I'm still able to, walk, take a long walk for a mile or two. And before that, that was not really possible. And really just the time on a day-to-day basis, the time of, between having to do these breathing treatments and how quickly my airways would fill up with mucus, just within a matter of hours, that time has significantly lengthened where, I can spend a number of hours out and about and not really think about being dependent on these breathing treatments to clear the airways of this thick mucus. And so, that being said, I've, now again, able to travel internationally, not really have to worry too much about, getting sick or, having to get intravenous antibiotics on a, just out of the blue if I were to get ill. So those are the things that have definitely changed. And again, like frequency of cough, nighttime coughing, sleeplessness. So these are all different factors that have affected my life that are quality of life changes and improvements.
Mm. And no, so that's good to hear that it's improving. And I think one question that I do tend to always ask is, so on paper, so you like your health records, if someone looked at that without actually getting to know you, what version of you would they see? And how does that compare to reality? Because I think for me, they're always two different dynamics. So I'd like to understand that a little bit more.
Certainly. I'll just quickly share a quick story. When I was, I've had very low lung function for, majority of my adult life. And when I was transitioning care from pediatric to adult cystic fibrosis care, there was a new pulmonologist coming on board. This is when I was like 21 or so years old. And, he hadn't met me in person before, but he just saw my medical records and saw that I had very low lung function, had been hospitalized a lot, and, had all of these, looked like a pretty sick patient. And nonetheless, like, my disease is advanced. There's no question about that. But when, he saw me in person and, could see sort of more of a healthier looking person, it really, he made the assumption that I was, just very ill and, was kind of surprised to see what I looked like. And a lot of people, when I meet a stranger, they're like, oh, would have no idea that you even have this disease or that you're very sick. And so, it's hard it's very hard to correlate or to just compare what you see in a medical record and the diagnoses and the advancement of the condition and how a person may live with that or carry that on a day-to-day basis. And, some of it does have to do with, not to get down this road, but just like a positive outlook and like feeling like, okay, instead of viewing things as like, oh, I can't do something, viewing it like, but I can do something else instead. So some of that too is like, well, I don't, yes, I am limited and all of, and physically and all of that, but, it hasn't completely stopped, living my life. Anyway. And so, I think that all can't be captured on any medical records. And, it's really important for, again, not just to look at the lung function numbers, but, again, like exactly, how much is this person able to live the life that they want to live the best quality of life that they can, and how can we think about how to measure that in a way that is meaningful to the patient?
That's a really good answer, and I think just to extend that line of questioning discussion, if you don't mind, we mentioned earlier on that your lung function was below that threshold. What does it feel like to be told that you're not eligible? And I don't know how many times you've been told that, but how does that actually feel?
It's extremely disheartening, to be honest, because like as I mentioned, I was at the time, getting pretty ill, meaning like my, not like the numbers on paper were showing that I'm very ill, but I was also starting to feel those effects and those symptoms as well, in that I was, needing these intravenous antibiotics all the time, having, flare-ups of the infections frequently, again, not able to live independently, all of these factors. And knowing that at that point that my life wasn't sustainable in that way for very long. In the sense that once the lungs deteriorate so much, then a patient with cystic fibrosis has to get a lung transplant. And once you get a lung transplant, you get new lungs, so you have new an improved quality of life, but it comes with a whole host of other issues that we don't need to talk about right now, but it's essentially like trading one disease for another. So it's like trading cystic fibrosis for another disease where you're immunosuppressed. Anyway, and so I wanted, it was very frustrating and scary to experience this onset of symptoms and to know that there may be a treatment, that I could potentially benefit from if I were to, be on the drug in the trial, and even the chance of that, and losing the chance of potentially being on a drug that could improve my quality of life is what was very frustrating and really saddened, made me sad, that I was fighting for my life so hard, and nothing could help me, nothing could stop this. And, there were multiple times where I contacted the pharmaceutical company and, pleaded or shared my case and was like, would you all open an expanded access trial early, to allow for patients like me, excuse me, who, were very much in need of therapeutics, who were sort of more of end of life kind of disease progression, and allow for patients to try the drug who are, fall below that inclusion criteria, right, of 40% FEV1. And, that didn't happen, but, all to say, fortunately, I was able to receive the drug after it was approved. So, it was actually right before I was going to be listed for a lung transplant. So I was going to be listed, and I was like, let me just wait a few weeks to see if I can get access, and was able to right in the nick of time. So it was really serendipitous, but
yeah. Well, it sounds like it's worked out okay this time, but I would imagine beyond your own situation, what could this mean for the CF community broadly? Like, who else is being left out, and what does that cost them? And I'm sure you've heard or you've spoken to a lot of people in these sort of situations.
Certainly. Well, yes, exactly. This is not unique to me. There are many adult patients who are, we're advanced in their lung progression, who have not been and are now continuously, as we're seeing the advancement of treatments, right? We now have these treatments that treat the underlying disease for some part of the population. But as we're seeing advancements in gene therapies, mRNA therapies, all of these types of treatments, then, again, those are going to be new therapeutics that are going to be in trials. But if we don't change the criteria for inclusion, or who, the population that could benefit from this within the trials, we're not going to, there are many patients that are not going to be able to access these, because though they may experience a quality of life improvement to some degree with the therapeutics that are already on the market, lung functions, as I've explained already, haven't really significantly changed for those that have more advanced lung disease. Additionally, there are this treatment in particular, I was very fortunate to benefit because of the type of mutations that I have. But there are many individuals who have more uncommon and rare mutations for which these therapies have not been effective for. And so this is a community, or this is populations that are more so minorities, underrepresented communities, as cystic fibrosis is primarily a Caucasian disease. And so this common mutation is mostly found in Caucasians. But, other ethnicities have more of these rare mutations that have not been treated by these medications that are on the market and are available. And, and this is a population too. So just those that obviously have advanced lung disease, but then the population whom have a rare mutations and advanced lung disease are really the population that are very much in the scenario that I was a number of years ago, and yet have no potential possibilities on the horizon. And so, this is an area that I strongly advocate for. And as we think about the development of, and there are treatments in development for these more rare mutations, but even so, nothing yet has come to market. And really, if we're at least able to be inclusive of this population when these types of therapy, when these gene therapies do come and are afforded to all mutations and all conditions, all variations of the disease, then at least we can be more inclusive within the trial design itself. So that's like one hurdle.
Which is the aim, which is the gold standard. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that leads me on into, so when we previously discussed about patient engagement, you said that it needs to start before trial design begins, not after. But we all have our own sort of approaches and styles, but what does that look like in practice for you? And I suppose the question is, why doesn't it happen?
I think it's a variety of factors. I think that this standard, right, the gold standard as of now, the measure of lung function and of this particular inclusion criteria of what lung functions measures can be included in the trial, have been used by the pharmaceutical industry as it's just been a standard set by companies that have come before, by the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation as per their recommendation a while ago, and what the FDA has been used to seeing. The data the standard that they understand as has been the measure of, quality of life in cystic fibrosis has been lung function. So with these various, sort of like ingrained or just embedded inclusion criteria, and just like the way that they've designed these trials, I think that companies are hesitant. And, it's also because it's branching out from something that has already been set as a standard. It would require extensive time, extensive resources, financial resources to, and then also early collaboration too with the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation and more with the patient community, and having these conversations, early on, bringing the patients involved into those early IND conversations with the FDA and say, hey, we've talked to the communities. This is how we want to change that. This is how we think that we want to run this trial. This is how we think we want to design it. And really would take a lot of early planning and early effort and resource intensive from various different capacities to change sort of a standard, you could say, that's just been used for all these years. And I urge companies to think about, especially as what I mentioned before too, as we're moving more into using these digital endpoints and digital measures to capture new kinds of quantitative data. Like, for example, there's some that I've just heard of these anecdotally, like there are some devices that are measuring the rate and the frequency and the type of cough that a person has, and using that as potentially an endpoint measure. So again, not to get too here into the weeds, but for example, the way that I cough, like sometimes it's a dry cough, sometimes it's more of a wet cough that produces the mucus. And depending on whether I am overall health well, or if I'm experiencing an onset of a pulmonary exacerbation, which is like the flare up of the symptoms of the lung, I'll experience like a dry, persistent cough, and then it will change into a wet cough when the mucus sort of builds up. And so this is an indicator of this type and change in cough and frequency is an indicator of whether I'm more healthy or more in like a sicker phase with the pulmonary exacerbation. And so if this can be effectively measured, because obviously up until now we're using, PROs ask, okay, what is your frequency of cough, right? That really doesn't give a lot of information. But if we're able to really, statistically use that information quantitatively and say like, using AI, right, using these digital measures where we're comparing this type of cough from, 2 weeks ago versus now and how it might be changing, then we can really use that as a effective and really a efficacious quality of life measure that can be then used in trials. So that's just one example of a way that we can really think about redefining and bringing in novel ways by which to capture data that's meaningful to the patient community and then to regulators and to the pharma companies as well. So, but really it just takes, right, this concerted effort, and it takes a lot of planning and it takes a lot of resources. And there is that, the hesitancy because of, what if this is not something that, the FDA is going to recognize or just isn't going to, there isn't going to show enough efficacy for this type of endpoint. But that's where it just takes, those early conversations and the planning and the collaboration. And, I think though that it's something that's extremely needed. And not just, obviously I'm using the cystic fibrosis example since that's my personal experience, but this goes to across conditions, across rare diseases, where this can be effective and utilized in different disease areas.
That's really, really interesting. So jumping off that, if you could say something to, I don't know, a clinical ops lead, a patient engagement director, whatever that role is within pharma, what would you say to them?
I would say a lot of what I've described now, and really, framing for their understanding to know why is it important for us to, first of all, be more inclusive in trial design, why it can be so meaningful and so important for not just a community who maybe there isn't a lot of treatments or therapeutics available, who have a great need for not just a treatment to come to market, but to get access as early as possible within a clinical trial setting to improve their quality of life as quickly as possible. So if we can be more broadly inclusive of patients in trials, we can gather more data earlier about how a treatment might affect the population across the board, not just such a small subset. So companies can understand more about a disease population, about how their treatment is affecting them positively or not. And there can then be that potential for this population to see quality of life improvements if this drug or treatment is efficacious. And the earlier as possible, the better. And so, by redefining endpoints and clinical outcomes and inclusions and exclusion criteria, you as an industry are allowing generally the broader access and quality of life improvements to patients who need it the most. And I think that if anything, that is what as pharma companies, you all do. That is what, the purpose is. That is the number one driver. And so if you can facilitate that and make that happen in even broader, in a broader scale, more inclusion, and brought faster to the patients, then why not? And I know that it is complex, and I know that it is, again, time, resource intensive, but please, you know, collaborate with the community early, understand what is needed and how that can be made possible. And also allow for the community to help you all too. You know, I know that I would be more than happy to, you know, come into these conversations with the CF Foundation, with the FDA, and share, you know, exactly as I've shared here, like what is important for the community? How can we work together to redefine this? And a lot of that support can come from the communities if, you know, we're able to be brought into these conversations, if we can be a part of it, if we can, you know, provide help in ways to make this a reality, many patients will do so. So yeah, I'd say that.
Well, thank you very much. And I think it's been a really, really good conversation. Sadly, we've run out of time, but I wanted to just frame it all with some data that I came across just before this chat. And in a recent review I read of UK cancer clinical trials, 41% of patients were automatically excluded with anyone who had a history of HIV, even if it was well controlled. So that's like a clear example of how inclusion-exclusion criteria systematically can filter out already underserved patients. And in that same, it's from the Institute of Cancer Research, they found that about 1 in 10 adults with cancer participate in trials, but they use the restrictive eligibility criteria is identified as a major barrier to access. So I think on the whole, there's a lot of work that's needed to make trials more accessible, not just inclusive, but making it accessible. And Ella, I think your insights were really, really good today. How can people find you? What's the best way to find you? Are you from your LinkedIn or Instagram? Where are you?
I'm active on LinkedIn, Ella Balasa. You can find me on I have a website as well. You can contact me there, ellabalasa.com. So yes, I would love to have any conversations and appreciate you all tuning in and listening.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ella. Take care. Speak to you soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.